outside Philadelphia brings heartbreak to a family and terror to a community. A young woman is dead, the killer gone. But the marks of his passage remain. South of Chicago, another mystery. A missing boy. A frantic search. Heartbreaking clues. Investigators struggle to find the boy and whoever took him. When victims are young, crime hurts that much more. And when the criminals are repeat offenders, it's a cruel turn of fate. Authorities are dedicated to solving these crimes and terminating the careers of those who are out to kill. At about 2 a.m. on June 20th, 1996, an off-duty ambulance crewman spotted a car abandoned on the road. It was parked on an exit ramp off Interstate 476, heading west away from Philadelphia. The car was running, and the headlights and radio were on. But no one was inside. The driver radioed 911. The emergency operator took the report, then dispatched 2 nearby troopers to the scene.
We will send a trooper out to the scene as soon as possible.
State Police Lieutenant Lenny Bandy was notified and headed to the highway interchange.
When the car was discovered, it was found with its driver's door open, the headlights were on, the radio was playing, and the engine was running. That was unusual to me.
It looked like a crime. The State Police Forensic Services Unit, headed by Corporal Alan Stewart, arrived at the scene.
Well, there was blood in front of the vehicle, and at that point I knew it was urgent to get everything started as quickly as possible.
At the front of the car was a tire iron. Near it, a small pool that appeared to be blood.
It was more than just an abandoned vehicle to me at that point. And it was a missing person investigation. It certainly was under suspicious circumstances with the presence of the tire iron and blood in front of the car and the hasty manner in which it appeared the occupant had left.
We collected the blood with the Q-tip, packaged it, we sent that out to the lab for DNA purposes.
Careful not to upset any potential evidence, they searched the car's interior and found a backpack. It appeared to be a college student's, but there was no identification inside. The car was registered to a woman in Brookhaven, Pennsylvania. Investigators learned the car was driven by her 22-year-old daughter, Amy.
1974.
While troopers spoke with Amy's parents, the crime scene processing continued.
One of the troopers had seen a pair of panties and shoes laying on a hillside. We went back to retrieve the pair of panties and shoes at that location.
Amy's mother later identified the shoes as her daughter's. It was looking more and more like a forcible abduction. Next to the clothing, troopers spotted a distinct tire impression, which was photographed.
Upon completion of the photographs, then we used dental stone to cast the tire impression.
The impression was sent to the crime lab. Amy's parents were worried. They knew the effects of crime firsthand.
Her father was a police officer. Her mother was an emergency room nurse. We wanted to do everything in our power to bring this young girl home safely to her family.
Here for a visit.
They had been out of town and hadn't seen their daughter in several days.
Very likely wearing this necklace at her
but knew that Amy had planned to go out with friends that night. Her parents gave a description of their 22-year-old daughter, including the tattoo on her ankle.
If you don't mind, I'd like to keep this picture so I can distribute it.
Do you want others?
As the APB went out for the missing college student, the Philadelphia area press jumped on the story.
She'll be right up for you, sir.
By morning, the media coverage brought forward Amy's friends, who had been with her the night before.
We were trying to retrace Amy's whereabouts, reconstruct her activities from the time that she was last heard from to the time that her car was found.
All of Amy's friends had the same story. It was an impromptu reunion of high school friends. They talked for a few hours, catching up. Friends said when Amy left the bar around 1:30 a.m., she was alone.
What's going on with her?
No one had seen or heard from her since.
Also had a denim jacket as well.
Tell me what happened.
At Delaware County's Criminal Investigation Division, Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer and Detective Charles List were shocked to hear their friend's daughter was missing.
I've known Paul for a number of years. I know Amy's mother, so we wanted to do anything we could to help with the investigation.
Detective Sergeant Seltzer contacted their superior, who immediately put them on the case.
I went to the captain, who was the chief of county detectives, and explained to him that we have a police officer's daughter that's been missing.
While search teams looked for Amy, a task force gathered at the state police barracks to plan the intense investigation.
We utilized what's known as victimology. We wanted to learn about Amy and her behaviors and the patterns of her conduct. We learned that she was a regular kid.
Amy Willard was a star athlete at George Mason University, a responsible student taking summer classes. No ties to anything or anyone dangerous. By 5 p.m., 15 hours had passed with no sign of the missing girl.
While we were in the meeting, they received a call from Philadelphia police that they had a body and it matched the description of Amy.
Children had discovered the nude body that afternoon in an isolated area of North Philadelphia. It was 25 miles from Amy's car. There was no purse or clothing on or near the body, but everyone knew who it was.
That's Amy.
The physical characteristics, the size, the height and weight, it was consistent with the description given to us by Amy's family, and most specifically the presence of a tattoo on her right ankle, which was consistent with the tattoo that Amy had.
Finding Amy this way was difficult for everyone involved. Before the autopsy, her parents confirmed their daughter's identity. The medical examiner determined the young woman had died of multiple blunt force trauma to the head and body. It was a vicious attack.
When we were at the autopsy, we noticed there was a pattern on her right side that was in the shape of squares with the X's in the middle of the squares that were actually burned into her right side.
The burn pattern was so distinctive, investigators believed if they could find its source, they could find the killer. The medical examiner also recovered semen and believed the victim was sexually assaulted. The fluid and samples of Amy's blood were sent to the lab for testing. At the Pennsylvania State Police Regional Crime Lab in Lima, experts determined the blood found near the car was Amy Willard's. The seminal fluid recovered from the victim was also analyzed. Using a technique known as PCR, examiners made millions of copies of an isolated DNA strand until it was large enough to decipher. Once they could read it, they put together a genetic profile of the possible assailant but they got no hits on any DNA database. Still, it was crucial evidence, according to Delaware County Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt.
We had the genetic profile of the killer. We just didn't have a name to go along with that profile.
They also believed they had his tire print. Lieutenant Dennis Luce, commander of training and technical support at the crime lab, examined the tire cast.
The cast that we were looking at was a tire that had 4 grooves and 5 raised areas. So when we did our search of the database, we were only looking at tires that had the same number of grooves. We determined from the database that it was a Firestone FR440 tire.
Although it was a common tire, it might help confirm or eliminate a suspect. Investigators also needed to examine the burn pattern from the victim's body.
We believed if we could find the source of that pattern injury, we could find out who the killer was.
From the burn pattern, a pathologist tried to determine the shape and dimensions of the object that made it.
Although he couldn't tell us what the object was, he drew a picture of what the object looked like.
The investigative team had a great deal of evidence: the burn pattern, the tire track, and the genetic profile of the killer. But they had no idea who he was. Knowing why Amy stopped her car might help identify the killer.
I have no idea.
Both Mom and Dad assured us the only reason she would stop if a police officer had pulled her over.
A police impersonator, a frightening possibility, but a real one. As the first few crucial days of the investigation passed with no solid leads, the law enforcement community grew frustrated.
It was a virtual whodunit. It was a needle in a haystack.
A vicious killer had stolen the life of this well-loved young woman, the daughter of a cop and a nurse, one of their own. And the investigators of Delaware County would never give up until they found him. In Delaware County, Pennsylvania, state police and county detectives were investigating the brutal homicide of 22-year-old college student Amy Willard. Many knew Amy, the daughter of a local police officer and a nurse. Investigators had good physical evidence, including a distinctive burn pattern on the body and the DNA profile of the suspected killer, but no suspects. One theory is that Amy stopped that night because someone impersonating a cop made her pull over. Detective Charles List sought information on known police impersonators.
I was surprised at how many police impersonators there were out there. We had a lot of interviews to do.
Many of those interviewed had solid alibis. But not everyone did.
No, I do not own a black Honda.
One suspect had a record of trying to pull over women.
You weren't on Route 1 at the entrance of Route 1?
Investigators could not corroborate his alibi for the night Amy was killed. And he worked near the place where the body was found. Detectives got a search warrant that allowed them to take a sample of the suspect's blood to compare his DNA against the DNA collected from the victim. State Police Lieutenant Lenny Bandy knew the genetic material was their greatest ally.
That was the most conclusive piece of evidence that we can use to include or exclude someone in our investigation.
The sample was sent to the lab for processing.
Yes.
The suspect in question also drove a car that could support the type of tire that left the impression near Amy's clothing. Examiners compared the tire cast from the scene to an inked impression of the suspect's tires. But reported no match. DNA experts eventually reported similar results. No match. The suspect was cleared.
There were numerous calls, tips that were made by the public. We were overwhelmed early on.
Despite checking every lead, they came up with nothing. Months passed. Frustration grew. Detective Charles List and Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer eliminated every known police impersonator. They had no idea why Amy pulled off the road. Then, late on the night of May 29, 1997, almost a year after Amy Willard's death, 19-year-old nursing student Patty Jordan had just left a nightclub in Philadelphia and was driving home.
I noticed that a car was coming behind me with their headlights speeding up behind me. So I just kept my eye on him, and I switched lanes, and then he switched lanes with me, and then I did it again, and so did he, and I sped up, and so did he. I slowed down, and so did he.
The daughter of a Philadelphia police officer, Patty knew she needed to find her father.
I thought to myself, I was going to the 2nd Police District. That's the police district by my house. And then I would just pull in there and call my dad.
Off the interstate, she stopped at a red light.
And that's when he just slowly came up from behind me. I could see him, I could see his headlights, and I thought to myself, this guy's gonna hit my car. And that's when he hit my car. And then that's when I was like, oh my God, what is this guy doing? He kept motioning for me to pull over and pull over, just to pull over. I was mad and I was scared.
But Patty Jordan was not going to pull over.
And I just thought, I'm getting this guy's plate number. I'm gonna tell my dad.
Eventually, the man turned and drove away, but not before Patty got the plate.
I said it over and over in my head, and as soon as I came home and saw my brother, I ran to the kitchen and wrote it down.
Sergeant John Jordan is Patty's father.
The murder of Amy Willard had been in the news, so I entered the tag into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and it came back to an Arthur Bomar. And I noticed that the registration was to a Ford Escort.
But Patty said the man was driving a Honda. Sergeant Jordan also found out that Arthur Bomar was a convicted murderer who was wanted for a parole violation in Nevada.
And the more I thought about that and what had happened to my daughter, I just had to call Delaware County. Detective Sergeant Seltzer and his partner, Detective Charlie List, spoke to my daughter. And I could see the look on their face. I'll never forget the look on both their faces as they listened to Patty recount what happened to her.
Patty's description of the driver who bumped her matched that of Arthur Bomar.
Can you tell us what happened?
Although the plate was registered to a Ford Escort, Patty said she was sure it was a dark-colored Honda behind her.
I-95, and that's when I noticed that
The plate might have been switched. It was their best lead by far.
It was the entire case. It was the entire case. There was nothing, I can't describe how important that was, just for her to grab that tag number and tell us. We wanted very much to speak with Mr. Bomar.
At first, they could not find the parolee. But after such a long and frustrating investigation, the investigators were surprised at how quickly the case took off.
We were a year into the investigation and following up every lead we could. Arthur Bomar comes into the picture within 3 days. Arthur Bomar is in custody.
Detective Sergeant Seltzer and Detective List went to interview Bomar at the Lower Marion Police Station, where he was being held on burglary charges. Bomar denied knowing anything about Amy Willard and said he had never been to the part of North Philadelphia where her body was found.
And you're still saying that you were...
He admitted he'd been to the bar Amy went to the night of her murder, but claimed he was not there that night. He was at a birthday party.
All right, Mr. Bomar.
After speaking with family members, we found that it was a lie, that he wasn't at the birthday party.
Securing a search warrant, investigators took samples of Bomar's cheek cells and hair to compare his DNA to the DNA recovered from the victim. The analysis at the busy State Police Crime Lab would take a few days. But because Bomar was in jail on another charge, Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt knew they had time.
Okay, Charlie.
A Montgomery County judge denied Bomar bail.
So there was no chance of him being back out on the street before we concluded our investigation. We had a lot of forensic evidence, and we wanted to carefully put all that evidence together because we only get one shot at him in court, and we wanted to make it a good one.
Police searched the area near where Bomar was arrested for burglary. Officers found a car with the same plate numbers Patty Jordan had given to her father. The plate was registered to a Ford Escort, but it was on a black Honda, just as Patty described. Technicians later found no evidence in the Honda related to the Amy Willard case. They needed to find that Escort. The case was heating up, but mysteries remained. The missing car, the peculiar burn pattern, and whether or not DNA would clear this suspect. After a year-long search, the investigators of Delaware County hoped they could solve these mysteries and find some degree of justice for a murdered young woman. Near Philadelphia, 22-year-old Amy Willard was abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed, left with a distinct burn pattern on the side of her body. A year later, Pennsylvania investigators had a suspect in custody. Arthur Bomar said he had nothing to do with Amy's death and claimed he wasn't at the bar where Amy was last seen alive. But detectives tracked down Bomar's girlfriend, and she had a different story. She was in hiding and fearful of Bomar. She said Bomar told her he was going to the bar in question on the night of the murder.
He start talking about.
Bomar confessed to his girlfriend that he watched Amy Willard leave the bar and followed her. He forced her to pull over, though the girlfriend didn't know how. Bomar said he then knocked Amy unconscious. He took her to North Philadelphia, where he raped and killed her. The girlfriend said Bomar was driving his Ford Escort that night. The statement of the girlfriend was a major break, but investigators needed evidence to back it up in court. Delaware County Detective Charles List and Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer believed the key was Bomar's Ford Escort.
His vehicle is very important because at some point Amy was in that car.
Absolutely.
We went to an insurance company and found they had been in an accident shortly after Amy's abduction.
The detectives learned the car was towed to a salvage lot.
We obtained a search warrant. We were hoping to find some type of blood, hair, fiber that would link Amy Willard to Arthur Bomar.
When the tow truck lifted the car, investigators were stunned. The oil pan had a familiar pattern. They believed it was the object that burned Amy's body. At the State Police Garage, the Forensic Services Unit processed the car.
What's that?
On the passenger side door panel, they found what appeared to be dried blood.
I'll take it down to the lab.
They removed the oil pan so it could be compared to photos of the burn pattern on the victim's body.
Yeah, that's it.
The technicians also collected the car's tires to check them against the tire impression from the scene of the abduction. Corporal Alan Stewart was part of the Forensic Services Unit.
We sent the oil pan to a pattern expert from the Armed Services, who then in fact did match the oil pan to the pattern that was on Amy's body.
Lieutenant Dennis Luce compared the tire cast from the crime scene to the print of a Firestone FR 440 tire from Bomar's car.
We were able to determine by comparing the track to the suspect tire that both had the same amount of wear.
Sergeant Luce, I finished looking at that tire track that you sent in, that tire you sent in,
It's consistent with the track from the crime scene.
Serology expert Cecilia Cassiola examined the door panel and found Amy Willard's blood.
Finding the victim's blood in the suspect's car puts the victim in the suspect's car.
But the most important forensic evidence came with the DNA results. It was a match. Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt.
The DNA evidence was irrefutable here. There was a 5 billion and 1 chance that Arthur Bomar was not the person who contributed the DNA found during the autopsy. So that obviously was the foundation of our case. In addition, we were able to link the car he drove to the thermal injury on Amy's body. Amy's blood was found behind the door panel in his car. The tires on Arthur Bomar's car left tire track impressions at the abduction scene.
It was enough to convince the jury. On October 1st, 1998, Arthur Bomar was convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to death. Amy's family has fought for the laws to be changed to keep offenders behind bars, but the law did not pass in time to protect an Illinois family. Aroma Park is an hour south of Chicago. On an afternoon in 1995, Micah Moulton got nervous when her 10-year-old son Christopher did not come home from fishing at 5 o'clock as expected. It was not long before she had a feeling something was terribly wrong.
I jumped up and I looked at the clock. It said 5:22, and I knew immediately I needed to go find him. I had to go find him at that moment.
Leaving her other kids at the house in case Christopher returned, she went down to the Aroma Park boat ramp on the Kankakee River, where Christopher normally fished.
I walked around the area, I called his name, started yelling out for him.
After more than an hour of searching, Micah called the Kankakee County Sheriff's Department. Under Sheriff Brad O'Keefe worried when he heard where the boy was last seen.
The speed of that river, we have a lot of drownings. A lot of people fall in and disappear in that river, so that makes it dangerous in itself.
Rich, not a Aroma Park Boat Club right away. You got a missing 10-year-old.
Micah told Deputy Rich Burns about Christopher. She had already checked with all of his friends. No one had seen him since 4:30 at the boat launch.
It was very unusual for him to do this, for him not to return home on time, and we knew it was very important to get the ball rolling, to get the search started.
He's 10 years old.
And I said, well, I'm going to go in the woods and look for him. He said, just wait. He said, hold on. And he made a couple of radio calls, and the next thing I knew, there were search dogs and search teams and the fire department out there.
We didn't know if he had fallen into the river or if he had walked off, if he was just lost.
Right away, they threw every resource into the search.
All the local police agencies sent people. So we had fire departments from Aroma Park and Kankakee. They had the boats in the water doing the search. Once they knew what we were looking for, a lot of the citizens came up and volunteered.
They briefed the search parties, describing Christopher, his clothing, his bicycle. The searchers were instructed not to touch anything they found.
We don't know what happened at this point, so we're searching.
Any evidence should be collected by trained evidence technicians.
Anything you find, call Detective Bertrand. We're going to process it and handle it as evidence. Detective Bertrand will come out and collect it. All right? So everybody go
They had to
over here and line up
organize
along these woods.
and stay organized.
We have an assistant in the command center who keeps track of who's where and who's doing what searches.
Fire department personnel checked the water and riverbanks. search dogs tried to track the young boy. Everyone prayed they would find Christopher quickly. Investigators interviewed anyone they could locate at the boat launch.
Over there? Did you see Christopher Meyer? Yes, ma'am. What did you guys see? Tell me everything you saw.
Two boys said they saw Chris with a man that afternoon, according to Kankakee County Administrative Chief Joe Mulcahy.
The man had a fishing tackle box with him, and in the box was some lures that were not appropriate for this area. It was saltwater lures, and the man did tell them that he was originally from this area, but had just came back from Florida.
The boys said there was a fillet knife in the box with the lures. They saw Christopher and the man leave the riverbank together. They could give only a vague description. A white male, tall, a mustache.
He had like all this neat stuff.
And we were concerned that there may be a possible abduction at that point.
No one slept.
We had detectives in here fielding calls all night. We had people searching the woods. We searched that woods 20 times, hoping that we would find something.
But that night, they didn't. Local news stations ran the story, broadcasting descriptions of Christopher and the unknown man he was seen with, and asking for more help. At the Sheriff's Emergency Operations Center, deputies and volunteers fielded calls. Many were tips suggesting they look into certain men as possible suspects. Investigators followed up on every tip, while the search continued, firemen dragging the river bottom. More than 18 hours had passed with no sign of Christopher. Then, the next morning, searchers spotted something in the water. A child's sneaker. Micah identified it as Christopher's.
We now have a shoe in the water. Chances are better now that he's in the water or something's there, so we got to intensify the search there.
Dive teams searched for any sign of the boy or his bike.
It would overhear people talking about, any news, did they find a body? And a couple of times I lost it and said, there's not going to be a body, they're going to bring home Christopher. And I just kept a positive outlook on it, because I couldn't ever let myself think or feel that he wasn't going to come home.
Those searching for Christopher would not give up either. That little boy was out there somewhere, and they needed to bring him home. 10-year-old Christopher Meyer was last seen with an unknown man near the Kankakee River in Aroma Park, Illinois. Investigators did not know if Christopher had been abducted or if he fell in the river where they had recovered one of the boy's sneakers. Micah Moulton is Christopher's mother.
I felt everything was going to be okay, or eventually I was going to wake up, that this was just a really bad dream.
But it was no dream.
I got something here.
On the second day, one search team spotted something. Christopher's bicycle. It appeared someone had carried the bike deep into the woods and tried to conceal it, according to Undersheriff Brad O'Keefe.
It's that much more critical. We're not searching anymore for a lost child. We're not searching anymore for a drowned child.
Now they knew someone had taken Christopher. Several witnesses said they saw Christopher pushing his bike with a white male who had a goatee. They said at one point the man was standing by the open trunk of a gray four-door sedan that had fishing rods in the back window.
Just a short.
He had a fillet knife in a leather case in his back pocket. Some of the witnesses worked with a police artist to create a composite sketch of the man. Investigators released the sketch to the media.
Once the picture was out, everybody had somebody in mind. So we're getting all kinds of tips and clues on who it might be.
Deputies followed up with every caller to the tip line.
We took them a composite sketch and asked them to look at it and identify it.
Yeah, that's a bus.
One name came up more than any other, Timothy Buss.
When was the last time you saw him?
Fairly new to the community, Micah Moulton did not know the name.
No, we just need to ask him.
And I remember somebody coming in and saying, Timothy Buss, oh my God, I can't believe he's out. And they kept going on, and I said, who is like, Timothy Buss? Who is this Tim Buss? Who is this Timothy Buss? And nobody would tell me.
The investigators all knew Buss. In 1981, Timothy Buss had abducted and murdered a 5-year-old girl in nearby Bradley, Illinois. He was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years. But he had been recently paroled. Lieutenant Larry Osenga of the Kankakee City Police Department's Violent Crimes Task Force offered his squad's assistance. They asked around Buss's old neighborhood.
The neighbors advised us, yes, he was in the community.
Kankakee police learned Buss was now living in Joliet, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. Lieutenant Osenga called Joliet Police Department. Joliet agreed to check on Buss's apartment.
So Joliet assisted us. We went to where his residence was. He was not there at the time.
But the Joliet police sat and waited. The searches in the Aroma Park area kept on as another terrible night passed. Then, 2 days after Christopher disappeared, the Joliet surveillance unit spotted a man approaching Buss's apartment. It looked like the suspect. He was alone. Joliet contacted the Kankakee officers, who immediately drove up to the city.
You been sparing the place? Yeah, about an hour now. Did you see him go anywhere? Sure he's in, right?
They checked the apartment,
When was the last time you saw him?
but no one answered. The place seemed deserted.
Hey, what's going on?
A neighbor noticed the police and told them she had seen Buss go out the back door.
He ran out of his apartment, jumped in his car with his headlights off, and he drove off at a high rate of speed and got away from us. We began a perimeter search trying to locate him, and we were not able to locate him.
A search of the apartment yielded no sign of the missing boy. APBs went out to law enforcement throughout the greater Chicago area with descriptions of Timothy Buss and his car.
Kankakee County Sheriff's Office, can I help you?
People began recognizing the sketch. A motel clerk in Braidwood, Illinois, called to say she thought Buss was staying there. Kankakee County sent Deputy Brady Bertrand to the motel in Braidwood, 25 miles south of Joliet.
At about 8 o'clock in the morning, Buss come out of the hotel and walked directly over to a dumpster in the parking lot of the hotel. He threw a pair of boots in the dumpster.
Deputy Bertrand radioed for assistance.
I'm just gonna stick with them. Need someone to come back and put boots on the dumpster.
Then he followed the suspect.
He initially got on I-55 northbound, which leads into the city of Chicago, but he ended up getting off a short distance later and driving to Wilmington and pulling down by the river and talking to some fishermen down there.
Deputy Bertrand waited for backup to arrive.
Stand by till you get there.
While he did, Kankakee County detectives Ron Kilman and Randy Hartman responded to the Braidwood Motel to collect the evidence.
The boots were retrieved. We're not sure what
evidence that is going to be connected to, but he apparently put them there for a reason. So we secured them, whether there was possible blood located on them, hairs or fibers.
The boots were sent to the lab for analysis. The Kankakee officers hoped they could get Bus to talk.
Yeah.
He was very antsy and looking around as if he wanted to get away from there, but he had no place to go.
Every time something goes wrong, you guys are going to start coming to me. Yeah, we are.
At first, the parolee was evasive, not wanting to talk.
And we'll get it worked out.
But eventually, he agreed to come to the Kankakee County Sheriff's Department for an interview.
This ain't right.
At the station, Bus denied knowing anything about Christopher Meyer. His lawyer arrived to discuss investigators' request for a consent to search Bus's car. Against the lawyer's advice, Bus signed the consent form.
I have nothing to hide, nothing at all.
At the Sheriff's Department garage, detectives Hartman and Kilman processed the suspect's car.
As a crime scene detective, we're basically putting a story together. And if you can do your job well enough, then you find that evidence that's able to tell you that story.
In the trunk, they discovered a car dent puller that appeared to have blood on it. There was also a tire iron and a tackle box like the one described by the boys who last saw Christopher. There was no fillet knife inside.
As we removed the items one at a time, then we were able to observe on the carpeting itself underneath the tools that there was a considerable amount of blood.
It was a difficult find, but an important one.
If in fact this was going to turn into a homicide, we needed to be able to put the boy and the suspect together.
Inside, the technicians also found a claw hammer.
It had dirt in the claw portion. What that told us was somebody's been doing some digging with this hammer.
On the passenger seat, the technicians recovered several head hairs. Like the other evidence, the hairs would be sent to forensics experts at the Illinois State Police Crime Lab. They had a suspect in custody and haunting evidence of foul play.
We still don't know where Chris is. We don't know if Chris is maybe hurt and bleeding. We were hoping we would find him stashed in a cabin or something along the river. So we never gave up hope that he would still be alive.
In 1995, Kankakee County, Illinois investigators were searching for 10-year-old Christopher Meyer, who was abducted while fishing. Evidence technicians found blood, hairs, and a dirt-encrusted hammer in the car of Timothy Buss, who had been seen with Christopher the day the boy disappeared.
They came in.
Our investigations led us to believe that you have...
Authorities arrested Buss and charged him with aggravated kidnapping.
Every time a child missing, you come. You know this ain't right. You know this ain't right.
He refused to cooperate. At the Illinois State Police Forensics Lab, DNA research coordinator William Frank examined the evidence from Buss's trunk. He would compare the blood from those items to a DNA parentage profile created from Christopher's parents and to a probable sample of the boy's DNA called a convenience standard.
The convenience standard that was used was the child's asthma inhaler.
From the swabs of the inhaler and the parents' blood samples, Frank created a genetic profile using PCR testing.
The parentage comparison from the child's parents was consistent with the inhaler.
He then checked that profile against the blood from the car.
When I compared the profile that was identified in the asthma inhaler to the profile that was identified in the blood stains from the suspect's vehicle, the two profiles matched.
They still held out hope that the boy was alive. Kankakee County Sheriff Bernie Thompson.
After Timothy Buss was in custody, we were still looking for Christopher.
And there was always that hope that we would find him alive.
A few days later, a search party that included Sheriff's investigator Kenneth Ponton discovered a pair of boys' briefs and later a fishing pole and part of a T-shirt.
We called Investigator Mulcahy and gave her the description of the items and asked her to check with the missing boy's mother, which she did, and the mother was able to identify that these items belonged to her son.
3 days later, in a part of Kankakee State Park, Will County deputies made the discovery that would finally end the search. Under a piece of plywood, partially buried, was the body of a small boy. He had been stabbed more than 50 times with a thin knife. It was Christopher. Evidence technicians collected a clump of dirt containing a boot print from the gravesite. They also collected samples of the soil in the area. Hair and fiber expert Ralph Meyer compared the hairs found in Timothy Buss's car to Christopher's using a comparison microscope.
Looking at the general appearance, the length, the distribution of the pigmentation, the fusi throughout the shaft, ovoid bodies.
The hairs were microscopically consistent in every regard. Geologist Ken Knight examined the soil samples taken from the gravesite and the soil found on the claw hammer.
We tried to determine if the knowns and unknowns had the same characteristics, the same amount of crystals or mineral particles, the same colors, same angularity of those particles, the same general type of botanical material.
Again, a match.
The fact that the soil from the hammer is consistent with a mixture of the soil samples from the gravesite indicates that the hammer was used to actually dig the grave.
Some of that soil held a partial impression of a boot print. Forensic scientist Robert Hunton compared boots Buss threw out at the motel to that impression.
I made a cast of that particular portion of the boot that had a similar pattern to the piece of soil. I compared those side by side. I was able to say that that impression could have been made by that portion, that small area of the right boot.
Investigators hoped more definitive proof would come from the DNA lab. William Frank checked samples from the victim's femur against the evidence he already had.
The genetic profile for the femur bone matches the genetic marker profile identified for the child's inhaler and also matches the bloodstains identified in the trunk from the suspect's car.
The forensic evidence proved that Timothy Buss abducted Christopher Meyer. He assaulted the boy, stabbed him repeatedly, then buried him in the woods. Buss was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and was sentenced to death. That sentence was commuted to life in January 2003, but this time there will be no chance of parole. Christopher's mother, Micah Moulton.
The anger and the sadness and the grief and all was so overwhelming, but I knew I could use it in a positive way to make a difference. I want laws changed. I helped in lobbying for the No Second Chances for Murderers, Rapists, and Child Molesters law, also known as Amy's Law.
That law, named for murdered college student Amy Willard, seeks to prevent the most violent criminals from being released on parole. It was passed by the U.S. Congress in 2000. In Pennsylvania, the night manager of a fast food restaurant is found brutally murdered, the apparent victim of a robbery gone bad. For 15 years, police are unable to identify a suspect. But then, an elite group of forensic experts agree to take on the case. a man disappears from his Lubbock, Texas home. All indications point to foul play. But until police can find the victim's body, they are powerless to prove murder. When the trail of clues stops, homicide investigators are often left with few options. But an elite group of forensic experts, known as the Vidocq Society, can heat up a cold case and apply their expertise to deliver collective justice. On February 4th, 1984, in the Philadelphia suburb of Falls Township, Pennsylvania, the manager of a fast food restaurant arrived for the early morning shift. He was alarmed to find that the front door was unlocked. Recently, there had been a string of robberies in the area. Nothing appeared to be missing. But in the kitchen, he discovered the night manager, Terry Brooks, lying on the floor. She had been brutally murdered. Within minutes, officers and forensic technicians from the Falls Township Police Department arrived at the scene. They found the 25-year-old victim lying face up on the kitchen floor. A large knife jutted out of her throat. A plastic trash bag had been used to cover her face. Judging by the coat she was wearing, it appeared Terry Brooks was preparing to leave for the evening. In the restaurant office, police found that the cash drawers and money bags had been cleaned out. The victim's shoes were found lying by the desk. Though this was just one of several restaurants to be robbed within a few months, it was the first to end in murder. Technicians searched for any clues to the killer's identity. They found nothing. No signs of a forced entry were found around the unlocked front door. Based on the evidence, police theorized that after Terry Brooks left the restaurant, she was ambushed by the robber and then forced back inside. Her death had been a violent one. Terry Brooks had been beaten, strangled, and then stabbed in the throat. She had been dead several hours. Hair and skin scrapings were found in the victim's hands and fingernails, indicating she had put up a fierce struggle. But in the days before DNA testing was available, examiners could only conclude that the samples had not come from the victim. Looking for any clue to help them identify a suspect, investigators interviewed the victim's parents. Terry, they said, was a cheerful young woman who made friends easily. She had put herself through college and worked hard, hoping to own her own restaurant one day. Recently, she had quit her job as a waitress for a better opportunity as the manager of the fast food restaurant.
Hey, babe. What brings you here?
She had just gotten engaged to a co-worker from her previous place of employment. Though Terry was living at home, her parents didn't know her fiancé very well. The engagement had been sudden. They couldn't think of anyone who might want to hurt their daughter. Terry's fiancée, 22-year-old Scott Keefe, also had no idea who could have committed such a brutal act. On the night of the murder, he was home sleeping. He had to be up early the next day. Around 6 a.m. the following morning, he drove by her house on his way to work. He knew Terry had worked late, and he wanted to be certain she had arrived home safely. When he noticed her car wasn't in the driveway, he became concerned and woke up her parents.
Hey, Mr. Brooks. How's it going?
What are you doing here, honey?
When they discovered Terry had not been home, they called the restaurant. That's when they learned she had been murdered. Though robbery appeared to be the motive behind the murder, police returned to the restaurant to speak with the manager. They collected all of the employee files, looking for evidence that the killer may have been a disgruntled employee. The manager could think of no one on his staff that had a problem with him or Terry. Everything suggested that Terry Brooks had been a random target. And for police, those are the toughest cases to solve. Desperate to generate a lead, examiners scrutinized all of the evidence collected from the crime scene. They were in luck. A single latent fingerprint was found on the trash bag that covered the victim's face. It was matched to one of Terry Brooks's co-workers at the restaurant. Detectives brought in the employee for questioning and to give blood and hair samples. But she didn't seem capable of the violence inflicted on Terry Brooks. And the employee had an explanation for the print. Before leaving on the night of the murder, she had replaced all of the trash can liners. She said that she hadn't noticed anything unusual that night.
We were told that you were supposed to...
However, she did recall an incident a few days earlier. Near closing time, two men came into the restaurant. They appeared drunk and were causing trouble.
Yeah, let me get a cheeseburger.
The employee called her manager. Terry tried unsuccessfully to defuse the situation. When she threatened to call the police, the men became verbally abusive. They made several threats before leaving. The employee didn't know the men and hadn't seen them since that night. Police finally had their first big break in the case. Now they needed to identify the killers before they struck again. Several area store owners had similar encounters with individuals who fit the description of the two men. But no one seemed to know who they were or where they could be found. The identity of the prime suspects in Terry's murder continued to elude police. Soon, the investigation into her murder turned cold. And it would remain that way for the next 14 years. After 14 years, it seemed that the 1984 murder of 25-year-old restaurant manager Terry Brooks would never be solved. But in 1998, police in Falls Township, Pennsylvania, decided to re-examine all of the unsolved homicides in their jurisdiction. Detective Sergeant Wynn Cloud came across the Terry Brooks case file.
There was a lot of physical evidence available, and I examined all that, and it was all good physical evidence and preserved well. I believe that this had a very high solvability.
Sergeant Cloud enlisted the aid of homicide detective Nelson Whitney and Deputy District Attorney Lori Markle. After reviewing the case files, the team found a hole in the investigation conducted more than a decade earlier.
At that time, there were several fast food restaurant robberies that were occurring in this area, and the investigation conducted in the 80s had really focused on that idea. So we decided that in addition to looking at the possibility that the murder was a robbery homicide, we would also learn more about Terry and investigate the possibility that the murderer had been someone who knew her.
Investigators tracked down the people who knew Terry and her habits well. They located her former manager. When he viewed the crime scene photos for the first time, one in particular caught his attention. Detective Nelson Whitney explains.
So one of the things that Terry would do every day would be to clean out the ashes out of the ashtray and place it in a little ledge above the desk. She would close the ledger on the desk. She would put the phone in a certain position, put the ruler and the calculator away. The photograph of the desk from the crime scene clearly showed that the ashtray was in the middle of the desk, that it had ashes in it. There was an open book there, a ruler was out, a calculator was out.
Terry was also known to kick off her shoes when she did desk work. The information was at odds with previous suspicions that Terry was accosted outside the restaurant and then forced back inside. And that opened up the possibility that she knew her killer and had even let him inside the store.
She opens the safe at some point, whether she was...
But so far, that was only a theory, and one that put investigators no closer to identifying Terry Brooks's killer. Police needed more help. For that, they turned to an elite crime-solving team headquartered just a few miles away in Philadelphia. There, in the historic Downtown Club building, some of the greatest criminal theorists had been meeting every other month since 1990. This is the home of the Vidocq Society, a non-profit private brain trust of the nation's most esteemed law enforcement officials, forensics experts, psychologists, and government agents. Dick Laventhal is the Director of Communications for the Vidocq Society.
The society is named after Eugene Francois Vidocq, Frenchman that lived from 1775 to 1852. We credit him with being the father of modern-day detective practice. He's truly our inspiration. He's a man that thought out of the box. He was the first detective who began to keep files and records on criminals' methods of operations.
The society is limited to 82 full-time members, one for each year of Vidocq's life. Originally, they assembled to discuss historical cases and mysterious unsolved crimes. That soon changed.
Very quickly, we segued into an organization whose reason for existence was to look into unsolved homicides and try to solve the anguish of families when there's a loved one who's been murdered.
To have an unsolved homicide accepted by the Vidocq Society, investigators must first present their case to its members. At the next Vidocq gathering, Sergeant Cloud did just that.
I presented this on a factual nature. I did not give any theories, so I wouldn't taint any of their opinions. Everything I gave them were what facts I gathered from the case, from the crime scene. And after I was done presenting to them, I was approached by probably 30 members, possibly even more, but 30 that were real interested in it.
Vidocq Society co-founder Richard Walter offered to donate his expertise to the case.
My area is crime assessment and profiling. And basically, crime assessment is the act of looking at the crime scene, what's there as well as what's not there at that crime scene. Then taking that information and reconciling that with known patterns of behavior that we know in terms of criminal activity. So we know a great deal about the offender from the crime scene.
For Walter, the violence observed in photographs suggested the killer was motivated by vengeance or anger, not money. Walter believed that the killer was someone close to the victim, and the robbery was staged to throw investigators off his trail. From the lack of organization observed at the crime scene, Detective Cloud also learned that the killer likely had little more than a high school education. He probably worked as a menial laborer, perhaps a cook at a pizza or hamburger joint. Because of his rage, experts theorized he likely had difficulty maintaining relationships with women. Investigators turned to the victim's parents, hopeful they could identify someone who resembled the profile. Terry's father was dying of liver disease. The couple didn't know anyone who resembled the profile. However, they recalled that on the morning of the murder, Terry's fiancé, Scott Keefe, had acted strangely. Though Keefe appeared upset to learn his fiancée had been murdered, he refused to go to the hospital to help identify the victim. He said he didn't want to be late for work. For Terry's parents, Scott's actions that morning had always led them to believe he was hiding something. Police agreed. To find out what that was, investigators interviewed Terry's old friends. None spoke highly of Scott. They were all surprised to learn Terry was engaged to him. Scott was possessive and jealous, and he was in financial trouble that allegedly resulted from a drug problem. Things became more strained when Terry took a pay cut to manage the fast food restaurant. Just before she was murdered, Terry had talked about ending the engagement. Based on the information, Detective Cloud began delving into Scott Keefe's background. What he found was an uncanny parallel to the psychological portrait generated by Vidocq Society experts, right down to his job.
Our ultimate suspect worked at a pizza joint, had been for years. He had several relationships, personal relationships, but they were very rocky.
With the help of the Vidocq Society, investigators had finally identified a suspect in the 15-year-old slaying of Terry Brooks. Now it was up to Falls Township Police to prove it. With the help of the Vidocq Society, an elite non-profit group of law enforcement officials, police in Falls Township, Pennsylvania had finally identified a suspect in the 1984 murder of Terry Brooks. Now, investigators turned to physical evidence collected nearly 15 years earlier to prove it. The biological evidence collected at the time of the autopsy was forwarded to the nearby drug scan laboratory. There, new DNA technology, unheard of at the time of the murder, had become a sophisticated crime-solving tool. Forensic scientist Diane Marshall examined the evidence. The samples had been carefully stored, and DNA is very stable over time. Genetic tests revealed that the skin found under Terry's fingernails had not originated from her. Marshall looked for DNA samples on the murder weapon to see if she could produce a match. But after so much time, it appeared that no traces of blood remained.
And I took apart the knife where the blade actually joined into the wooden handle, and I was digging around there with a scalpel, a clean scalpel, and I removed like really this crusty old material that was in there. And then I did process that specimen for DNA. I determined that there was 2 different DNA types there, one which matched the victim and one which matched an unknown suspect. And that DNA type from the suspect was the same that it was recovered under the fingernails.
Investigators had finally uncovered evidence that could link a suspect to the murder. Though all the circumstantial evidence was pointing to Scott Keefe, they didn't have the proof needed to obtain his DNA samples. They would have to find another way to get the evidence they needed. Detective Whitney suggested they focus on his trash. Once trash has been placed on the curb, it is considered abandoned property in the eyes of the law. Police can legally examine and collect its contents. On trash day, investigators arranged for a garbage truck to make only one pickup: the trash in front of Scott Keefe's house. A few blocks away, police took possession of the garbage and hand-delivered it to the crime lab. Hoping to find something that contained DNA samples, Diane Marshall zeroed in on several cigarette butts recovered from the trash.
When one smokes a cigarette, one deposits their saliva on the filter. Included in that saliva are epithelial cells, which come from the lining of your mouth.
Marshall successfully extracted cellular material from 2 different brands of cigarette butts found among the debris.
So I isolated the DNA from the saliva deposited on the filters of each of the brands of the cigarettes. And I noticed that one particular brand had one specific DNA type. It did not match any of the evidence from the crime scene.
But DNA from the second brand did. On the 15th anniversary of Terry Brooks's murder, Scott Keefe was brought in for questioning and to provide blood samples. According to Detective Nelson Whitney, he never realized he was a suspect.
We told him that he was an important witness, that he was, because of his close relationship with our victim, someone who can give us information that no one else could, that would help us in our case, and he was only too happy to help.
After answering a few questions, detectives asked if he would mind taking a polygraph test as a matter of routine. Keefe agreed. The blood samples were rushed to the lab.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, Polly, control these tractions.
Hours later, while awaiting the DNA tests, Vidocq Society co-founder Bill Fleischer carefully reviewed the polygraph results.
The polygraph records these physiological changes as part of our individual defense mechanisms, known commonly as fight-flight. In a polygraph situation, we ask questions. If those questions pose a threat to your well-being because you lie to them and there's the fear of being detected in the lie, your body immediately reacts physiologically. Heart starts to beat faster. Blood's redirected to different organs in your body. Your mouth gets dry, your knees get weak, the butterfly in the stomach, your palms get sweaty.
Though the suspect denied any involvement in Terry's murder, Fleischer concluded that Scott Keefe was being deceptive. Now, examiners looked to scientifically verify that Keefe was a murderer. When his DNA samples were compared to those recovered from the victim, examiners found a match. Police confronted the suspect with the test results. Scott Keefe had no choice but to confess. Keefe stated that he often stayed with his fiancée at the restaurant when she was working late. On the night of February 4th, 1984, Terry Brooks decided to end their engagement. Keefe flew into a rage and killed her. He then staged the scene to make it appear that the murder was the result of a robbery gone bad. After so much time, the victim's family finally had answers. Deputy District Attorney Lori Markle.
Terry Brooks's family had to live for 15 years with not knowing who had killed her or seeing that person face any measure of justice. It meant a great deal to be able to, on the morning of February 5th, 1999, go to Mr. and Mrs. Brooks and say, "We've arrested the person who killed your child. He's in custody. We've amassed considerable physical evidence against him, and he's confessed."
Scott Keefe pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. In the Terry Brooks case, a misleading crime scene led investigators to some wrong conclusions. But in some cases, detectives face a more daunting set of circumstances. No crime scene at all. On Sunday, May 19, 1991, Jim Dunn and his wife received a late-night call at their Yardley, Pennsylvania home.
Alicia.
The caller identified herself as Alicia Hamilton, the girlfriend of the Dunn's 24-year-old son, Scott. Upset, Alicia said Scott had disappeared from their Lubbock, Texas home.
What are you talking about?
Jim told Alicia not to worry. He was expecting a call from Scott any day. But Scott never called. And Jim Dunn's attempts to reach his son were unsuccessful. Though concerned, he knew that Scott was probably busy with his hobby, buying and restoring cars.
Yes, it is. Dale, this is Jim Dunn, Scott's father.
I hadn't talked to Scott in about a week, and we'd been talking. We all usually talked at least once a week, and of course Scott was always had some kind of a project going. He was looking for money to help him buy a new car or buy a new body for a car so he could change the motors from one to the other.
But after a few days passed with no word, Jim Dunn contacted his son's boss at a car stereo installation company in Lubbock, Texas. The boss said Scott hadn't shown up for work in several days. When he last saw him, Scott hadn't been feeling well and asked to leave work early. He left his tools and his car at work and had his girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton, come pick him up. Scott said he hoped to be back at work in a few days. The boss told Jim Dunn that Alicia Hamilton called the shop a few days later. She believed Scott had left her for another woman. But Scott's father didn't believe his son would simply abandon his prized cars. He contacted Lubbock police to report his son missing. But there was little investigators could do. As an adult, Scott Dunn had the right to be missing. More importantly, there was no proof that a crime had taken place. Still, Detective Tal English agreed to look into the case.
He basically told me how unusual it was for Scott to be gone at all, just to disappear like this. And two things that he was really concerned about that concerned him was he had left his tools at his work, and he had left his car there, and had not taken either one. Those two items were extremely important to him, and Jim knew that he wouldn't just leave that.
Later that evening, detectives contacted Scott's live-in girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton. She had last seen him just hours before he disappeared. She said she brought Scott home from work after he complained of feeling sick. She put him in bed and made him some tea. She wanted to stay and take care of him, but Alicia was already late for her waitressing job. Scott insisted that she go. Alicia said goodbye and went off to work. She hadn't seen him since. Though she had no idea where Scott had gone, Alicia had discovered something unusual. While rearranging the furniture, she found that a piece of carpet underneath the sofa had been neatly cut out. Unsure of the significance, investigators asked to look around the residence. In the bedroom, they found the missing piece of carpet. It had been duct taped to the floor and was covering a bare patch of the rug.
No idea.
Alicia hadn't noticed it before. Underneath the patched carpet, investigators noticed large reddish-brown stains. They appeared to be blood.
When we saw that it looked like a crime scene, we kind of backed up. That's when our identification section was called in. They came out, and we wanted them to photograph the scene prior to actually anything being moved.
Tests confirmed that the stains were human blood. Though it was unclear if the blood had originated from missing 24-year-old Scott Dunn, the finding indicated that something violent had happened inside that bedroom. A concerned father's intuition had exposed a possible homicide. While looking for answers in the disappearance of 24-year-old Scott Dunn, police in Lubbock, Texas made a troubling discovery. In the master bedroom of the apartment the young man shared with his girlfriend, detectives discovered bloodstains underneath a section of carpet. Authorities scoured the room for more evidence. Under a light source, technicians found copious amounts of blood throughout the room. On the walls and ceiling, they found smears and streaks of more blood. It was a telltale sign that someone had tried to clean up evidence of a brutal crime. Blood samples, carpet fibers, and the duct tape from the bottom of the carpet were collected. They also retrieved Scott Dunn's hairbrush for possible DNA samples. At the crime lab, examiners successfully generated Scott Dunn's DNA profile from hairs collected from his brush. When that was compared to the ones extracted from all the blood evidence, they found a match. For Detective Tal English, there was no doubt Scott Dunn had met with foul play. But the investigation was about to face a crushing setback. Prosecutors wouldn't touch the case.
According to the district attorney's office, Texas law required a body to actually open a homicide investigation, and we didn't have that. We had evidence indicating that there was probably one that occurred, but without that body, it was going to be difficult to actually open it.
Texas authorities intensified their search for proof that Scott Dunn had been murdered. His girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton, was questioned again. Though she couldn't explain the blood evidence, Alicia remained convinced Scott had run off with another woman. As the questioning continued, however, she thought of something else. She and Scott had been having problems with a neighbor, a man named Tim Smith. According to Alicia, Tim had been harassing her in recent weeks. Alicia said she met Tim at a local nightclub a few months back. She admitted that she began dating him outside of her relationship with Scott. When she realized the mistake she had made, she tried to break it off with Tim. But he couldn't seem to let go. He began to follow her and would show up at the apartment she shared with Scott.
Sure everything's okay? Yeah, now that she tried, according to her, to distance herself from him. Tim wouldn't let that happen. He lived in the same apartment complex at an apartment that was further down from where their apartment was, and was hanging around a lot, and she just couldn't get rid of him.
Though authorities didn't officially have a crime, they now had a potential suspect. Before looking closer at Tim Smith, however, they first needed to rule out that Scott had left town with another woman. Investigators tracked down a woman who had been spending a lot of time with Scott prior to his disappearance. She admitted she and Scott had become close friends, but nothing more. Just before he disappeared, Scott told her that he wanted to end his relationship with Alicia. But he admitted to being nervous about the confrontation. Alicia's ex-boyfriends had warned Scott she was controlling and abusive. One stated she was constantly looking for proof that he was being unfaithful. Something as innocent as a greeting card from an old friend would set Alicia off into a jealous rage. She threatened her old boyfriends with physical violence, and sometimes she tried to make good on those threats. Scott feared how Alicia would react to the news that the relationship was over. Alicia Hamilton wasn't the caring and concerned girlfriend she had presented herself as being. But that hardly proved she had anything to do with Scott's disappearance. Police paid a visit to Tim Smith, the man Alicia claimed had been harassing her and Scott. He was in the process of packing up his apartment. When detectives asked where he was going, he gave a startling answer. He and Alicia Hamilton had just bought a place and were moving in together. Tim Smith denied any involvement in Scott Dunn's disappearance. Then, officers noticed a roll of duct tape. It appeared similar to the tape found in Scott Dunn's bedroom. At the Lubbock Police Department Crime Lab, criminalist Scott Williams compared the tape found at Tim Smith's apartment against the tape found in Scott Dunn's bedroom.
We look at the physical characteristics. This would include looking at the color, the texture, any type of embossing on the duct tape. And of course, in duct tape, there are fibers or strands running through the duct tape. We look at the spacing and what those fibers are made of.
All of the characteristics matched. Next, the chemical composition of the adhesive was analyzed. The two samples were identical in every way. And there was something else.
I noticed on the side of the roll of duct tape that there was fibers and hairs adhered to the side. I asked David Young, a person who does our hair analysis, to determine if these could have had some other common origin in the case.
Trace evidence examiner David Young compared the hairs on the roll of duct tape found in Tim Smith's apartment with ones from Scott Dunn's hairbrush. He found one consistency after another.
It basically tells us that at some point in time, Scott Dunn was around that roll of duct tape, and therefore, since we linked the duct tape to part of the crime scene. It helped put Scott Dunn with that roll of duct tape that was possibly at the crime scene as well.
Police now had a physical link between the possible crime scene and Tim Smith's apartment. Tim Smith was now the prime suspect in a missing persons case, and his relationship with Alicia Hamilton could not be ignored. But Scott Dunn's fate remained a mystery. Until authorities could produce his body, they would be unable to prove murder. Police in Lubbock, Texas suspected that missing 24-year-old Scott Dunn had been murdered. His girlfriend, Alicia Hamilton, and a man named Tim Smith were emerging as the prime suspects. But without the victim's body, they were unable to prove that harm had come to Scott Dunn. The case threatened to go cold. But Scott's father, Jim Dunn, refused to let his son's case slip away.
I'd continued to press the issue and for almost a year, and was trying to find out as much as I could about Alicia Hamilton, who she was. And also then the case had stalled because the district attorney, I'd spoken to him a couple of times, and he said, "Dunn, I don't know why you're calling me." He said, "You don't even have a body. You don't have a crime." He said, "It's just a missing person."
Determined to find justice for his son, Jim Dunn traveled to Albuquerque, New Mexico, Alicia Hamilton's hometown. He began digging into her past, looking for anything that could demonstrate she was capable of murder. He found nothing. He prepared to return home to Pennsylvania, empty-handed.
I came back to the hotel. I just relaxed and was kind of beaten down from not really finding out anything that would really help me that much, and flipped on the television set and just caught the very end of a TV show. Here was these detectives and a whole group of people called the Vidocq Society investigating unsolved homicides. And I said, my goodness, those people are right in Philadelphia, which is like 25 miles from where I live. I was in Texas.
Jim Dunn contacted the group. Members of the Vidocq Society invited him to present the case at their upcoming gathering. After the presentation was finished, Vidocq Society co-founder Bill Fleischer spoke one-on-one with Jim Dunn.
You could see that he was beside himself, that he was a distraught father. He definitely believed that his son had been murdered. He felt that Alicia Hamilton was involved in some manner in Scott's disappearance and murder. And he was looking for help. He was a human being that was in need of help from professionals.
Authorities realized they had to first prove that a murder had taken place. Without a body, that would not be easy. Vidocq Society members turned to renowned crime scene reconstruction expert Tom Bevel for help.
Crime scene reconstruction is especially useful in cases, for example, where you don't have a body, where there's a question as to what might have taken place. Do we just have a person with a minor bleeding wound that has left on their own power? Or do we have a case in which there's a serious injury, such as possibly death?
For answers, Bevel needed to determine what type of object had caused the blood spatter patterns found in Scott Dunn's bedroom. Though most of the bloodstains had been smeared in an attempt to clean up the scene, some cast-off patterns remained intact. Using an object coated with blood, he was able to recreate the size and shape of the stains observed at the crime scene. They were consistent with having been caused by a blunt object like a bat or a pipe. Having established that Scott Dunn was violently beaten, Bevel next looked to determine if the 24-year-old could have survived such an assault. For that, he would need to establish how much blood had been shed. He poured blood onto a similar piece of carpeting until the dimensions of the stains matched the ones found on the floor of Scott Dunn's bedroom. He concluded that no one could have survived the amount of blood loss necessary to replicate all of the stains. When presented with the findings, prosecutors finally agreed to take on the case. Vidocq Society experts had helped transform a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. It was the break Lubbock police had been waiting for. Now, investigators focused on finding evidence that could physically link Alicia Hamilton and Tim Smith to the murder. They began reviewing files for anything they might have overlooked. They found something. Some of the hairs recovered from the duct tape found at the crime scene had not originated from Scott Dunn. Tim Smith was brought in for questioning the following day. He continued to deny any involvement, and, eager to cooperate, he provided police with a hair sample. Alicia Hamilton provided one as well. Examiners compared the samples taken from Tim Smith and Alicia Hamilton to the unidentified hairs collected from the blood-stained duct tape found in Scott Dunn's bedroom. Examiners concluded that the unidentified hairs had originated from the two suspects. For authorities, the findings provided enough evidence to arrest Alicia Hamilton and Tim Smith. The couple, currently living together, were taken into custody and charged with murder. Investigators believe that when Scott Dunn tried to end his relationship with Alicia, she became enraged. Unable to handle the rejection, she lashed out and beat the young man to death. Police believe she then turned to her other boyfriend, Tim Smith, for help in cleaning up the scene and disposing of Scott's body. A jury found Alicia Hamilton guilty of murder and sentenced her to 20 years in prison. Tim Smith was also found guilty of murder. He received 10 years probation. Scott Dunn's body has never been found. His father, Jim Dunn, was asked to join the Vidocq Society to help the parents of murdered victims. He agreed.
And because of my involvement there, I think as a result of being involved with the Vidocq Society and being actually a member of the Vidocq Society, that I can return a little bit and give them thanks in a different way, and at the same time maybe help someone else that was in the same position I was 10 years ago when Scott was murdered.
The Vidocq Society says its only client is truth. In that respect, they are no different from the law enforcement and forensics experts they help out. But when killers are cunning and the truth is elusive, Vidocq Society experts provide the new perspective to bring cold cases back from the brink.